Chapter 11 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Yoganand. The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. A New Alarm. The next 2 minutes seemed an eternity to Frank, spinning rapidly along on his trusty wheel as he was. He wanted to know the worst and yet dreaded to pass beyond the trees where the field would be in full sight, because it would be distressing if he discovered the shop and hangars blazing and everything gone. Still, Frank was not the one to shirk bad tidings, and consequently he increased his speed all that was possible. "Bully!" Such was the exclamation that involuntarily burst from his dry lips when, having burst from behind the barrier, he had a clear view of the field. For the shed was there as intact as ever, and also the 2 hangars sheltering the aeroplanes. Some distance back, far enough removed to avoid any danger to the gasoline in the storage houses, Andy was tending to a bonfire, while the other boys seemed to be carrying shavings and trash thither in bags and baskets. Old Colonel Josiah Wimpers was bobbing and bustling around on his crutch and seemingly bossing the whole shooting match, as Frank laughingly said to himself. Of course, he saw now what Andy had been doing. For some time, the other had threatened to clear the shop of all the accumulated rubbish of the winter, and the notion must have seized him just after Frank left for town. "Hello, back again, are you, Frank?" laughed his cousin, as the rider dropped off his wheel close to the bonfire. "Cleaning house, you see. Threatened to do this a long time back, and as we have to sleep in the shop now, thought I might as well get at it. But what's that you have brought along, Frank?" "My goodness, your gun. Now, what sort of game do you expect to get with that thing?" "Don't know," returned Frank grimly. "Might be Jules Guerin for all I can say." At that, Andy dropped the long stick with which he had been pushing the trash into the heart of the blaze and stared at the other as though stunned. "Didn't I know you had something on your mind, though?" he muttered. "See here, Frank, ain't I on this thing too? What do you know about Jules Guerin? Ain't he fixed tight in the stone jug? I'm not from Missouri, but all the same I want to know." "So say we all of us," remarked Larry, who had come up while they were indulging in these few remarks, and was able to give a good guess as to the nature of what had been said. "Please confide in us, Frank. We'll keep mum." "Sure we will," pleaded Elephant. Stuttering Nat only wagged his head and moved his jaws, but his pantomime stood for volumes with those who knew his infirmity. It turns out that our old friend Jules gave them leg bail a week ago along with a couple of other convicts. But though they recaptured the 2 fellows, crafty Jules is still at large, Frank said quietly. At that, Andy came near having a fit. "My goodness gracious! Hear that, would you fellows?" he exclaimed. "Now we know who fired that nasty shot at us this morning, and he meant to hit us too. Oh, the coward, to stand down there and just let us have it when we couldn't give him back as good as he sent. Frank, is it going to end up flying?" Andy looked pained at the very idea, and Frank could hardly keep from laughing at the miserable face his chum exhibited. "Oh, I don't know," he replied. "There's no reason it should, that I can see. We can avoid that section, or else keep high when passing, so he never would have the least chance at hitting us, going a mile a minute. Besides, perhaps he'll find himself in hot water presently, when Chief Valor gets a line on him." "Does the chief know he is loose?" asked Larry. "He does now, but he never suspected it until I dropped in on him," replied the other calmly. "But see here, how did you know?" demanded Elephant. "The chief told me," laughed Frank. "Oh, say, is this fair, Frank?" complained Andy. "You're just getting the whole lot of us balled up. You told the chief and the chief told you. Please slip the curtain, won't you? Let us see the game." So Frank, taking pity on them, condescended to explain. Colonel Josiah had joined the group and was an eager listener to the recital. The old traveler had himself been through a vast number of adventures in his time, for he had delighted in exploring odd corners of the world seldom heard by ordinary people. Hence, he delighted in listening to his voice when they were narrating some stirring event that had come to their experience. All sorts of exclamations arose when they heard what the warden of the state penitentiary had to say about Jules. Andy even looked about him suspiciously, as if he might entertain a feeling approaching timidity, lest the desperate escaped convict suddenly appear and threaten them in some way. "Now I know why you went after your gun, Frank," he remarked. Not that I blame you a particle, remember. Don't I remember the dark face of the Jules and how he stared at me and ground his white teeth when they took him away? All this time I've allowed myself to sleep sweetly under the belief that since he was bound to stay behind stone walls at least 8 years, I needn't be afraid. But sometimes even walls can be scaled. Is it loaded, Frank? Your gun, I mean? To oblige him, Frank laughingly opened the breech and inserted a couple of shells. Shucks! Only number 10s? Ejaculated Andy. If it had been me now, I'd have brought a handful of buckshot ones. Much good these would do now if Jules was running away and had covered 100 yards. Then I'd be willing to let him run, said Frank. What I want them for, most of all, is to meet Jules if he persists in advancing too close. They were still discussing the matter an hour later, or at least some of them kept it up, where Larry started the fire inside the shop and began the necessary operation looking to a dinner to which the old colonel had been invited on condition that he relate a few more of his strange experiences in China, Tibet, and northern India. Look who is coming, called out Elephant, and of course this made them all turn their heads, even Larry running to the door, gun in hand, as though he had heard the remark and thought it might refer to the dreaded Jules himself. A car was coming from the direction of the town and in a cloud of dust. Naturally, the first thought that came to Frank was that it might be Mr. Marsh and his companion Longley. But as the breeze lifted the curtain of dust, he immediately discovered that this was not so. Half a dozen men were crowded in the car, and one of these half arose in passing to wave a hand vigorously toward the group of boys in the field. That's Chief Valor, remarked Andy with more or less eagerness in his voice. And those others are some of his men, Frank went on. They don't mean to lose any time about looking Jules up, do they? Hey, are you sure about that? Asked Elephant. Because none of them had a uniform on. And what good are the police in plain clothes? Oh, there are times when they can do more without their uniforms than in them, Frank remarked. And this ought to be one of them. Suppose now that keen-eyed Jules happened to be on the lookout and saw a car loaded with blue coats come along. Wouldn't he hide, all right? Well, that goes without saying, fellows. As it is, he might never suspect a thing. I've often seen as many fellows jammed in a car, and so have every one of you. One good thing is, Valor ought to know that section pretty well, remarked the old traveller. He's been brought up here and scoured the country as if he had a fine-tooth comb many a time. He will know how to close in on Jules if the fellow is hiding there, which I doubt. Why do you say that, sir? Asked Frank, who had a genuine respect for the opinions of the veteran, based as they were on long experience and observation in all parts of the world. It's only a surmise on my part, Frank, replied the colonel. We all admit that Jules is a very clever and long-headed rascal. Very well. Don't you suppose that he may regret having given way to sudden temptation and fired at you boys this morning? He will, on reflection, fear that you may guess who did it. For of course Jules does not know that his escape has been kept a secret all this week, in the hope that he might be recaptured and nothing need to be told. Follow me, boys? Oh, yes, sir, Frank declared. And in that case, the chief will have all his trouble for his pains, since Jules will never make tracks long before this. He may be out of the county by night. That is true, providing that he does not allow a fierce desire for revenge to stay his feet, replied the old man soberly. Usually the veteran was not the one to imagine trouble when there was none in sight, and knowing this, Frank looked at him somewhat uneasily. But before anything more could be said, they were surprised to see stammering Nat coming toward them on a run, for he had been watching the last of the bonfire to make sure it did no harm. And of course, as he was brimful of excitement, he had lost all power of control over his voice. He tried the best he knew to regain the mastery of his vocal cords, even resorting to an old expedient of whistling, and perhaps had served him on some previous occasion. Finding everything of no avail, he clutched Andy by the sleeve and started dragging him around the corner of the shed. Hey, what ails you, Nat? Shrilled the struggling Andy, wondering whether the other could have lost his mind because of his great affliction. Another moment, and the rest heard Andy give tongue in a way that announced his complete surrender to the same mysterious source of excitement that had mastered Nat. Of course, this needed an explanation, and accordingly Frank and Elephant dashed off, with Colonel Josiah stumping along close behind, and even Larry, leaving his cooking dinner to come after them, still clinging to Frank's gun. The end of chapter 11.